You think you know how this country started. You know the bedtime story version. The real story is messier, stranger, and considerably more embarrassing. Let's go. 1. We picture the Founding Fathers as a band of brothers, arm in arm, burning with the same righteous fire for liberty, unified in purpose and vision. This is one of the most aggressively wrong ideas in American popular history. They despised each other, viciously, personally, in writing. Adams and Jefferson's mutual contempt ran so deep that political allies kept their correspondence secret for years, and the two spent nearly a decade refusing to communicate at all. Hamilton and Jefferson built competing political machines specifically designed to destroy each other's legacies while simultaneously serving in the same cabinet under Washington. Washington himself had to physically beg his own cabinet members to stop publicly attacking one another, writing that the infighting would destroy the government before it had a chance to function. The Constitutional Convention of 1787 nearly collapsed multiple times, with entire state delegations threatening to walk out permanently over disagreements that had nothing to do with British tyranny and everything to do with raw political self-interest. These were brilliant, ambitious, deeply competitive men who happened to share a common enemy for long enough to win a war. The moment that enemy was gone, they turned on each other with remarkable efficiency. Calling the founders a unified team is like calling a bar fight a choir rehearsal because everyone was in the same room. The harmony existed in the mythology, not in the meeting notes. 2. George Washington is sold to every American schoolchild as the selfless general who just wanted to go home to his farm, a humble servant of the people who reluctantly accepted power and gratefully surrendered it. This portrait is a masterwork of personal branding, and Washington was his primary architect. He was an extraordinarily skilled political operator who curated his own myth with ruthless precision and considerable help from people whose careers depended on his continued greatness. He owned over 300 enslaved people at the time of his death and structured his will specifically to delay their freedom until after his wife, Martha, died. A legal arrangement that protected his estate's financial position first and human lives second. He lobbied aggressively for military command during the Revolution and was deeply, visibly offended on the occasions when his contributions went under-recognized by Congress or his peers. His supposed retirement to his Virginia estate was punctuated by constant political correspondence, meticulously designed to maintain his centrality to every major national decision. Perhaps most tellingly, he wore a custom-designed military uniform to the Continental Congress before anyone had voted to give him command of anything, a move that historians describe with some consistency as a calculated audition for a role he absolutely intended to get. The humility was real in some ways and performed in others. A man who genuinely didn't want power doesn't show up to the job interview in full uniform. He just doesn't go. 3. The story every American learns is that colonists dumped British tea into Boston Harbor because they were heroically opposed to being taxed without having a vote in Parliament, a principled stand for representation and liberty. The fuller picture is considerably more commercially motivated. The Tea Act of 1773 actually lowered the price of tea for colonists by cutting out middlemen and streamlining distribution. The problem was that cheaper legal tea also undercut the thriving market in smuggled Dutch tea, which had been enormously profitable for a specific class of colonial merchants. John Hancock, one of the most prominent Sons of Liberty and a celebrated patriot hero, was simultaneously one of the most successful smugglers in the colonies, with a direct financial stake in making sure the East India Company's newly competitive pricing never gained a foothold. The men who dumped the tea were destroying private property belonging to a corporation, not the British Crown, and several of them had personal bottom lines that improved the moment that tea hit the water. The taxation without representation slogan was powerful, emotionally resonant, and genuinely believed by many ordinary colonists who had nothing to do with smuggling. But the men funding and organizing the movement had very material, mercantile motivations running underneath the rhetoric. The Tea Party was less liberty or death and more our black market margins are getting squeezed. Noble in the branding, considerably messier in the accounting ledgers. 4. The story of Paul Revere is one of the most perfectly constructed myths in American history. One heroic man, one horse, one legendary warning cry that launched a revolution. Almost none of the iconic details are accurate. William Dawes wrote a parallel route the same night covering different territory. Samuel Prescott joined them en route and was actually the only one of the three riders who completed the full journey to Concord because Revere himself was captured by a British patrol before finishing his ride. The phrase "the British are coming," the line every American child associates with that night, was almost certainly never said. Colonists still considered themselves British subjects at that point, so the warning as reported by contemporaries was that the regulars are coming out, referring to the professional British military forces, not some foreign enemy. The ride itself was part of a pre-organized alarm system involving dozens of riders and signal networks spread across multiple towns, a coordinated intelligence operation rather than one man's spontaneous heroics. The version most people know comes from a Henry Wadsworth Longfellow poem written in 1860, 85 years after the event, and Longfellow admitted he adjusted details for poetic effect. History gave the lasting credit to the rider who got caught. The man who actually finished the mission, Prescott, got a footnote. Fame has always been a terrible auditor. 5. July 4th. The date, the signing, the fireworks. The national holiday built around a specific moment of collective action. The problem is that almost nobody actually signed the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, and the date on the document is essentially a publication timestamp rather than a record of a ceremony. Congress voted for independence on July 2nd, 1776, and John Adams wrote to his wife Abigail that July 2nd would be the date celebrated by future generations as the birth of American independence. He was wrong about the date and right about everything else. The Declaration was adopted and sent to the printer on July 4th, but the formal parchment copy that people picture, the one with all the famous signatures, wasn't signed by most delegates until August 2nd. Several delegates weren't present even in August and signed weeks or months after that. At least one didn't add his name until 1781. Then there's the genuinely extraordinary fact that both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died on July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the adoption, which history found impossibly poetic, even though the date was already historically imprecise. The most celebrated date in American history is essentially a shipping notification. The actual product arrived weeks later, with considerably less fanfare. 6. The Constitution is presented as a timeless document protecting the rights of every human being on American soil, a universal guarantee of freedom written by men who understood liberty in its fullest sense. This version requires skipping past several specific passages in the actual text. The 3/5. Compromise counted enslaved people as 60% of a person for the purposes of congressional representation, a provision that gave slaveholding states increased political power in the House while granting the people being counted 0 rights, 0 votes, and 0 legal standing of any kind. The word woman does not appear in the original document. Women had no constitutional standing whatsoever under the text as written. The original Constitution also contained no Bill of Rights, the 10 amendments that most people associate with core American freedoms. Those were added in 1791, 2 years after ratification, following fierce opposition from critics who correctly noted that the original text left individual liberties entirely unprotected. Several founders, including George Mason, who drafted Virginia's own Declaration of Rights, refused to sign the final Constitution specifically because it failed to abolish slavery and lacked any individual rights protections. The foundational document of American freedom came with an asterisk the size of a continent. The fine print ran for another century. 7. The image is iconic and the lesson is universal. Benjamin Franklin, kite in hand, key dangling in the storm, discovering electricity in a single dramatic moment of genius. Franklin did not discover electricity. Electrical phenomena had been observed, documented, and actively studied by European scientists for decades before Franklin's 1752 experiment. He was building on established research rather than working in a vacuum. His actual contribution was proving that lightning was electrical in nature, a genuinely important scientific finding, and then doing something immediately practical with that knowledge by inventing the lightning rod, a technology that saved an enormous number of buildings and lives across 2 centuries. The famous kite experiment may not have happened precisely as described in any case. The only detailed account came from Franklin himself, written years after the alleged event, and no witnesses were ever produced or named. Franklin was simultaneously one of the most productive scientists and most effective diplomatic operators of the 18th century, which history tends to flatten into a single charming grandfather caricature. The lightning and the kite make for a better story than the decades of methodical research. Franklin didn't discover electricity any more than someone discovers gravity by dropping something. He poked it with a stick, documented what happened, and built something useful. That's different, and it's still remarkable. 8. All men are created equal. The most quoted line in American history, presented as proof of Jefferson's boundless moral vision and the philosophical foundation of the Republic. Jefferson enslaved over 600 people across his lifetime. He didn't stumble into this contradiction accidentally. He drafted language condemning the slave trade in an early version of the Declaration of Independence, language that was removed at the insistence of Southern delegates, and Jefferson did not fight meaningfully for its inclusion when it mattered. He fathered at least 6 children with Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman at Monticello, who was also the half-sister of his deceased wife, a relationship confirmed by DNA evidence in 1998, after being dismissed as rumor for nearly 2 centuries. Jefferson wrote at length in his private correspondence about the moral evil of slavery, while simultaneously depending on it entirely for his lifestyle, his considerable debts, his political standing, and his physical comfort. He freed only 2 enslaved people during his lifetime and 5 more in his will. The remaining people he enslaved were sold to pay his debts after his death. Writing all men are created equal while owning 600 human beings isn't simple hypocrisy. It's a masterclass in the particular kind of compartmentalization that allowed a man of genuine intelligence to see the contradiction clearly and choose comfort anyway. The nation has been sorting through that choice ever since. And 9. George Washington's wooden teeth are one of the most durable biographical details in American popular culture, a homey, humanizing fact about the stoic father of the country. His dentures were not made of wood, not once, not in any version. Washington's dental problems began in his 20s, and by the time of his first inauguration, he had a single natural tooth remaining in his mouth. His dentures were constructed from a combination of ivory sourced from hippopotamus and elephant tusks, human teeth, animal teeth, and metal hardware. The human teeth component is documented in Mount Vernon's own financial records, which show Washington paying small sums for extracted teeth pulled from enslaved people living and working on his property. A common practice of the era that the wooden teeth story conveniently obscures. His dental pain was severe enough to be visible in his public appearances. The tight-lipped, stern expression in virtually every famous portrait of Washington was partly a consequence of ill-fitting dentures that distorted the shape of his jaw and made smiling genuinely painful. The wooden teeth myth has persisted for 2 centuries, partly because it's easier to remember and partly because it's considerably more comfortable than what the records actually show. The real story involves the mouths of enslaved workers. That's why the wooden version stuck around. 10. The Minutemen occupy a sacred place in American mythology as brave, disciplined colonial soldiers, ready at a moment's notice, standing their ground against the most professional military force in the world. The actual picture is considerably more chaotic. Colonial militias had no standard equipment requirements, meaning men arrived at engagements carrying whatever firearm they personally owned, which created significant ammunition incompatibility problems in the field during active combat. Desertion rates in the Continental Army were not a minor logistical headache. At certain points, Washington estimated he was losing men to desertion faster than he could recruit replacements, and he wrote to Congress about this with the barely contained desperation of a man watching his enterprise dissolve. The famous engagement at Bunker Hill, which was actually fought on Breed's Hill, is celebrated as a colonial victory when it was in fact a British tactical victory. The colonial forces were driven from the position and suffered significant casualties. Washington wrote repeatedly to Congress about the unreliability of short-term militia forces, calling the system destructive to any serious military campaign and arguing it was structurally incapable of winning a sustained war. The Minutemen were genuinely brave men who showed up under difficult conditions with inconsistent equipment and uneven training. They were also frequently hungry, poorly supplied, and halfway home before the engagement concluded. Mythology smoothed the chaos out considerably. 11. The image of the founders is almost always a religious one. Godly men, Bibles in hand, invoking the Christian God while establishing a nation under divine authority. The most intellectually influential founders were largely deists, a philosophical position that acknowledges a creator but explicitly rejects organized religion, church authority, biblical miracles, and the divinity of Jesus Christ. Thomas Jefferson's relationship with Christianity was so skeptical that he literally took a razor blade to his personal Bible and cut out every supernatural event, every miracle, every resurrection appearance, and every mention of angels, producing a slim volume of purely moral, philosophical teachings now housed in the Smithsonian. Benjamin Franklin expressed open doubts about the divinity of Christ near the end of his life in writing. John Adams wrote privately that the story of Jesus had been corrupted into a fantastical doctrine he found intellectually unsustainable. The Treaty of Tripoli, negotiated under Washington and unanimously ratified by the Senate in 1797 under Adams, states plainly that the government of the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. That's not a fringe interpretation. That's a ratified treaty. The Constitution itself contains 0 references to Jesus Christ, Christianity, or the Bible. The only religious clause prohibits religious tests for public office. The Christian nation framing requires considerable selective reading of documents that are, in most cases, not very long. 12. Alexander Hamilton's cultural rehabilitation over the past decade has been extraordinary, and the story told most often is of a scrappy immigrant, a self-made outsider, a champion of the common people fighting entrenched power. Hamilton was one of the most aggressively aristocratic political thinkers among the founders and was openly, on the record, distrustful of democracy and of ordinary people's capacity for self-governance. At the Constitutional Convention, Hamilton proposed that the president and senators serve for life, a structure so close to an elected monarchy that even his political allies in the room rejected it without serious debate. His recorded convention speech includes the observation that the people are turbulent and changing and seldom judge or determine right, a sentiment he expressed not as a private concern, but as part of a formal argument for limiting popular influence on government. His financial system was deliberately constructed to concentrate wealth and credit access among the propertied elite, and he was explicit that this was the goal, not an unintended consequence. Jefferson and Madison built their entire political movement in direct opposition to what they called Hamiltonian aristocracy, treating his vision as a fundamental threat to Republican government. Hamilton was a brilliant man of genuine historical importance. He would have found the folk hero, man of the people framing absolutely bewildering and probably insulting. The fan base is real, the populist mythology is not. 13. The Continental Congress is remembered as the brilliant governing mind of the Revolution, the assembled genius of the founding generation working in coordinated purpose to build a nation under impossible pressure. It was a legislative catastrophe that nearly lost the war through pure administrative dysfunction. Congress routinely failed to achieve a quorum, the minimum number of delegates required to conduct any official business, and sessions would collapse for days or weeks at a stretch because representatives simply chose not to show up to a meeting they found inconvenient. The paper currency they printed, called Continentals, was issued in such reckless quantities that inflation destroyed its value within a few years. The phrase, "not worth a continental," entered the English language specifically to describe something utterly worthless, which is a remarkable legacy for a government's primary financial instrument. Washington wrote to Congress with increasing urgency that their failure to supply his army with food, wages, and ammunition represented a greater existential threat to the Revolution than any British military campaign. The soldiers who suffered through the winter encampment at Valley Forge were not defeated by the British army. They were starving and freezing because Congress could not organize the logistics of supplying an army located roughly 20 miles from the capital. The birth of democratic self-governance nearly died because the democratic self-governors couldn't get enough people in the same room to keep the enterprise running. 14. Every American history class presents the Revolution as a broadly popular uprising, a unified people rising against a shared oppressor with common purpose and near universal support. The actual political landscape was dramatically messier. Historians estimate that roughly 1/3 of colonists were loyalists who actively opposed independence and wanted to remain part of the British Empire, and another substantial portion were functionally neutral, uninvested in the outcome either way. Between 60,000 and 80,000 loyalists fled the colonies during and after the Revolution, a mass population displacement that American history treats as a footnote rather than the significant civil rupture it actually was. In regions including New York, South Carolina, and Georgia, Loyalists outnumbered Patriots by enough that the revolution in those areas functioned as a civil war between neighbors, not a unified colonial front against a distant empire. The British military was able to recruit tens of thousands of colonial loyalists into active military units that fought directly against the Continental Army throughout the war. Many Native American nations sided with the British specifically because the Crown's proclamation of 1763 had attempted to limit westward colonial expansion, and independence meant the immediate removal of that constraint. The revolution that everyone supposedly supported was actively opposed by roughly a third of the country and viewed with indifference by much of the rest. It was a very loud argument that one side eventually won. 15. Betsy Ross and the First American Flag is one of the most beloved founding stories in circulation, a patriotic seamstress visited by Washington himself, stitching liberty and stars into fabric that would define a nation. There is no historical evidence from the period to support this story in any form. The first published account of Betsy Ross designing and sewing the first flag appeared in 1870, 94 years after the alleged event, when her grandson William Canby presented it to a historical society based entirely on family oral tradition passed down across multiple generations. No contemporary documents, diaries, official records, congressional minutes, or letters from 1776 mention Ross in any connection to the flag. The designer of the flag's specific layout is officially unknown. A congressman and designer named Francis Hopkinson submitted an invoice to Congress claiming creative credit for several government symbols, including the flag, was denied payment, but was never formally recognized or disproven either. The flag resolution of 1777 established the basic design requirements without attributing the concept to any individual. A nation that defines itself by its commitment to documentation and founding records accepted its most iconic symbol's origin story on the testimony of one man who wasn't alive when the event supposedly happened. That says something interesting about what we need to believe. 16. The Liberty Bell, ringing triumphantly on the 4th of July, 1776, pealing out across Philadelphia until it cracked from the sheer force of freedom, is one of the most cinematically satisfying moments in the American founding mythology. The crack's actual origin is unknown, the bell's role in the independence celebration is unconfirmed by contemporary sources, and the bell did not become associated with the concept of liberty until decades after the Revolution ended. The bell cracked shortly after its original installation in 1752, 24 years before independence, and was recast twice by local Philadelphia metal workers, meaning the famous bell is itself a replacement of a replacement. No account written in 1776 mentions the bell ringing on the 4th of July. The story linking it to independence was popularized in an 1847 short story, a work of acknowledged fiction that readers apparently decided to absorb as history. The bell wasn't called the Liberty Bell until 1837, when the abolitionist movement adopted it as a symbol because of the word liberty inscribed on its surface, giving it a name and a meaning that came from a completely different political struggle than the one people associate with it. The large visible crack that exists today developed in the 1840s, and attempts to repair it made the damage worse. Perfect symbol for a history built substantially on revision. 17, the Second Amendment, and what the founders meant by it, is one of the most contested historical arguments in contemporary American life. The dominant popular claim is that the founders wanted every individual American armed as a personal check against tyranny. The historical context points in a considerably more complicated direction. The full text of the amendment opens with the words, "a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state," a clause that was not decorative and was not grammatically incidental. It was a stated justification for the right that followed. The founders feared standing armies as instruments of tyranny, but they also feared unregulated armed citizens. Shays' Rebellion in 1786, a violent uprising by armed farmers that state government couldn't effectively suppress, was a direct and frequently cited catalyst for calling the Constitutional Convention in the first place. Multiple states in the founding era had laws regulating who could own firearms, where weapons could be carried, and requirements to register them with local authorities. The Supreme Court's reading of the Second Amendment as protecting an individual right to own firearms independent of militia service, the interpretation most people treat as obvious and original, was not established until the 2008 decision in District of Columbia versus Heller, more than 2 centuries after ratification. Asking what the founders intended about guns while living in a world of single-shot muskets and no professional police forces is a question that requires far more historical context than it usually gets. 18. Valley Forge is the defining symbol of American military suffering and moral perseverance, Washington's freezing army enduring impossible hardship and emerging in the spring reborn, forged by adversity, into the force that would win the revolution. The fuller story involves considerably more American institutional failure and considerably less noble inevitability. Approximately 2,000 soldiers died at Valley Forge during the winter of 1777 to 1778. They did not die in combat. They died from disease, exposure, and malnutrition, while supply depots containing food and usable clothing sat unused because of bureaucratic failures and congressional dysfunction happening less than a day's travel away. Washington came so close to resigning his command in frustration at Congress's inability to supply his army that several of his letters from that period read as formal farewell documents. Multiple prominent officers were simultaneously lobbying to replace him with General Horatio Gates. Philadelphia, 20 miles away, was a fully functioning city where British officers were attending dinner parties and theatrical performances during the same months his men were dying in the snow. The eventual turnaround came largely from Baron Friedrich von Steuben, a Prussian officer who created the training manual that professionalized the Continental Army, and who had been introduced to Washington with a substantially exaggerated resume he never corrected. Valley Forge was a tragedy of American mismanagement, salvaged by a Prussian who lied on his application. The mythology cleaned it up considerably. 19. American exceptionalism includes the foundational claim that this nation invented democracy, that before 1776, the world stumbled in political darkness until the founders lit the lamp of self-governance. This is a claim the founders themselves would have found embarrassing in its historical ignorance, because they spent enormous energy studying democratic and republican systems that had existed for centuries before them and openly acknowledged their debt to those models. The founders studied Greek city-states, the Roman Republic, and the British Parliament with the intensity of graduate students who knew their dissertation committee was watching. Madison's research notes from the period leading up to the Constitutional Convention constitute a comprehensive comparative study of governing systems across history. The term republic is Latin. The structure of the Senate directly mirrors the Roman Senate. The architectural choices for government buildings were deliberately, consciously Roman in design and symbolism. Some historians argue that the Iroquois Confederacy, which had operated a sophisticated representative governing system for centuries before European contact, influenced elements of the federal structure, a claim that remains debated but is taken seriously by serious people. Switzerland had operated a federal republic since 1291. The Dutch Republic had existed since the late 16th century. America didn't invent democratic governance any more than it invented the wheel. It built a consequential vehicle from parts that had existed for a very long time and then convinced itself it was the first to think of it. The innovation was real, the origin myth is not. 20. The Constitutional Convention is presented as the great open deliberation of American democracy. The people's representatives gathered to debate freely in the light of public scrutiny. It was conducted in complete secrecy, with windows nailed shut in Philadelphia's summer heat, armed guards posted at the doors, and every delegate sworn to absolute silence about the proceedings. The delegates voted on their first day of business to conduct everything behind closed doors, with no press access, no public observation, and no official record released to the public. James Madison took the most complete notes available from the proceedings, but he stipulated in his instructions that they not be published until every single delegate in the room was dead. They appeared in print in 1840, more than 50 years after the convention ended. The convention had also been called for a specific limited purpose, to amend the Articles of Confederation, not to replace them. The delegates exceeded their legal authority on the first substantive vote they took, scrapping the articles entirely and writing a new governing document from scratch, a decision that was technically unauthorized by the state legislatures that sent them. Rhode Island refused to send delegates at all. New Hampshire's delegation arrived so late they missed the majority of the proceedings. The foundational document of American transparent democracy was drafted in a sealed room by men who were already exceeding their mandate before they started. Transparency was apparently a second draft value. 21, Thomas Paine wrote Common Sense, the pamphlet credited by many historians with crystallizing the argument for independence and reaching more ordinary colonists than any other single document of the period. He is treated as a founding hero, a beloved voice of the people. He died in poverty, effectively friendless, rejected by the country his writing had helped create. After publishing The Age of Reason, a thorough and unapologetic critique of organized religion that targeted Christianity specifically, Paine became a social pariah in America with a speed that his former allies found convenient. John Adams, once a fellow patriot, publicly called him a mongrel between pig and puppy and attributed dangerous social disorder to his influence. When Paine returned to America in 1802 after years in France, he was denied a seat on a public stagecoach by a driver who announced he didn't transport traitors. He received similar treatment repeatedly in his final years. Only 6 people attended his funeral. Years after his death, an English admirer dug up his remains, intending to return them to Britain for a proper memorial. The plan fell apart, and Paine's bones were subsequently lost. They have never been found. The man who arguably wrote the revolution into popular existence was refused a ride on a public coach by the country he helped found. America has always had complicated feelings about the people who tell it the truth at full volume. 22. Washington's farewell address includes a famous warning against political factions, and this warning is often cited as proof that the founders were noble statesmen above partisan maneuvering, opposed to the divisive party politics that came later. The founders didn't just fail to prevent political parties, they invented the ruthless, personal, character-destroying political party system within the first decade of the Republic, while Washington's warning was still fresh in the room. By 1796, the Federalists and Democratic Republicans were running coordinated opposition campaigns, funding rival newspapers, and attacking each other's integrity in print with a ferocity that would make most modern political operatives uncomfortable. Jefferson secretly funded a journalist named James Callender specifically to publish vicious personal attacks on John Adams, while simultaneously serving as Adams's vice president, a conflict of interest that surfaced when Callender later turned on Jefferson and published the Sally Hemings allegations in print. Hamilton published a 54-page public document attacking the character, mental fitness, and judgment of his own party's presidential candidate, John Adams, in the middle of the 1800 election. Washington's own administration was functionally paralyzed by the warfare between Hamilton and Jefferson before he had been president for 3 full years. The founders warned against political parties with the rhetorical energy of a committed arsonist warning against fire, while actively holding the matches and arguing about which direction to throw them. 23. The Articles of Confederation failed, everyone agreed, and the Constitution was the obvious, mutually supported next step in the natural progression of American self-governance. This version requires setting aside the fact that replacing the Articles was a contested, legally questionable political operation engineered by a specific faction of nationalists who used a crisis atmosphere to push through changes that a significant portion of the population actively opposed. The Articles of Confederation required unanimous consent from all 13 states to be amended in any way. The Constitutional Convention bypassed this requirement entirely, declaring that ratification by just 9 states would be sufficient to establish the new government, a decision that had no legal basis under the existing framework. Many anti-federalists genuinely preferred the Articles, arguing with some coherence that the new Constitution would create exactly the kind of centralized, distant, powerful federal government they had spent years fighting a war to escape. Patrick Henry, whose "Give me liberty or give me death" speech is one of the most quoted lines of the Revolution, refused to attend the Constitutional Convention because he smelt a rat and spent the subsequent ratification fight arguing the Constitution was a dangerous consolidation of power. The Federalist Papers, the celebrated philosophical essays by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay, were explicitly propaganda documents written under a collective pseudonym to persuade the specific state of New York to ratify, not neutral political philosophy offered for the ages. The Constitution replaced the Articles the way a corporate acquisition replaces a company. Technically voluntary, strategically engineered. 24. The period immediately following the revolutionary victory is typically presented as the dignified, purposeful work of nation building, the founders settling into the steady construction of a republic they had earned. The post-revolution period was characterized by economic near-collapse, violent civil unrest, cascading political crisis, and a widespread, documented fear among the founders themselves that the entire experiment in self-governance was about to fail within a decade of its birth. Shays' Rebellion in 1786 and 1787 saw thousands of armed farmers in Massachusetts seize courthouses and directly confront a state government that literally could not pay its own soldiers to suppress them, because the state was as broke as the men it was trying to stop. The economy after the Revolution was in serious distress. Inflation was severe, war debts were suffocating, and individual states were printing competing currencies that were largely worthless outside their own borders. Multiple states were on the verge of defaulting entirely, and the federal government, under the Articles, had no power to tax anyone, leaving it dependent on voluntary contributions from states that mostly didn't pay. Washington wrote in 1786 that he feared the Republic would be remembered as a farce, and that he genuinely doubted its survival past another decade. The years immediately after the Revolution looked less like triumphant nation-building and more like the morning after, when someone has to figure out who owns the building and who pays for what got broken. 25. John Adams is the founder that history treats as the gap filler, the forgettable occupant of the space between Washington and Jefferson, a man of limited consequence, sandwiched between giants. Adams may have made more individually consequential decisions than either of the men who flank him in the popular imagination, and he paid a heavier personal price for his integrity than almost anyone in the founding generation. He secured the French alliance while serving as America's first diplomatic representative to Europe during the Revolution, a negotiation so critical that without French military support, financial backing, and ultimately the French naval fleet at Yorktown, the Revolution almost certainly ends in defeat. As president, Adams chose not to escalate into full war with France in 1798, despite enormous domestic pressure and a naval conflict that had already begun, a decision he believed cost him his re-election and which he always privately considered his finest act in public life. He was the only major founder who never owned an enslaved person, a fact that receives surprisingly little attention given how loudly the others are celebrated for their liberty rhetoric. He successfully defended the British soldiers accused in the Boston Massacre, the very event most effectively used to inflame revolutionary sentiment, because he believed that even defendants who were despised deserved a fair legal process. The founder who demonstrated the most consistent integrity is the one history treats as a footnote. The algorithm for historical fame has never heavily weighted consistency. 26. The Founding Fathers are presented as elder statesmen, gray-haired and grave, their wisdom earned across long lives and deep experience. Several of the most critical figures in the founding were by any modern measure quite young when they did the work history remembers them for. Alexander Hamilton was 21 years old when he became Washington's chief aide-de-camp and functioned as one of the most important operational minds in the Continental Army. He was 32 when he wrote the substantial majority of the Federalist Papers under deadline pressure while also practicing law. James Madison was 25 at the start of the Revolution and 36 at the Constitutional Convention, where he is credited with the document's primary intellectual architecture. Aaron Burr was 20 when he joined the Continental Army and served in some of the war's most demanding campaigns. The Marquis de Lafayette, the French officer whose military contributions to the American cause were genuinely substantial, arrived in America at 19. The average age of the signers of the Declaration of Independence was 44, which sounds older until you consider that Benjamin Franklin, at 70, was doing significant statistical work pulling that average upward. Remove the eldest third of the signers, and the group skews young by any standard. The men who rewrote the political map of the Western world did much of the most important work in their 20s and 30s. History aged them up for gravitas. 27, the end of slavery in America, is often framed as the fulfillment of a founding promise, the inevitable arc of history bending toward the freedom the founders always intended. The Constitutional Convention explicitly protected slavery through multiple specific provisions, and several of the most powerful delegates made deliberate calculated choices to entrench it rather than allow even the possibility of its gradual elimination. The 3/5 Compromise gave slaveholding states increased congressional representation without giving enslaved people any rights. The Fugitive Slave Clause required free states to return escaped enslaved people to their enslavers, legally conscripting the North into enforcing Southern slavery regardless of individual state policy. The slave trade was constitutionally protected from any federal interference until 1808, a specific 20-year guarantee written directly into the founding document at the explicit demand of South Carolina and Georgia. Charles Cotesworth Pinckney of South Carolina openly told his home state legislature after ratification that the Constitution gave the South more protection for slavery than they had dared hope to secure going in. Madison, who privately acknowledged slavery as a moral catastrophe, argued against including anti-slavery language because Southern states would refuse to ratify any document that contained it, and he was correct. Calling abolition inevitable given those founding choices requires ignoring a section of the Constitution specifically designed to ensure slavery lasted at minimum another 20 years. Inevitability is usually just hindsight dressed up in better clothing. 28. Washington is remembered as a military genius, the indispensable strategic mind who outmaneuvered the most powerful military force in the world through brilliance and daring. He lost more battles than he won, was repeatedly outgeneraled by British commanders during the critical early years of the war, and the revolution was ultimately decided as much by French intervention and British political exhaustion as by American battlefield performance. Washington lost New York City in 1776 in a series of engagements where he was badly outmaneuvered, losing approximately 5,000 men captured at Fort Washington in a single disaster that many historians attribute substantially to his own command decisions. The decisive victory at Yorktown in 1781, the engagement that effectively ended the war, was made possible by a French naval fleet commanded by Admiral de Grasse blocking British reinforcement and evacuation routes. Without that fleet, Cornwallis could have been supplied, reinforced, or simply evacuated, and Yorktown is a siege that doesn't happen. French ground troops, French financing, and French naval power were as consequential to the final outcome as the Continental Army. Washington's genuine strategic gift was arguably not battlefield brilliance in the traditional sense, but the rarer ability to keep an army intact through repeated retreat and strategic survival, understanding that staying in the fight was itself a form of victory. That's a different and more complicated kind of genius than the mythology decided to tell. 29. Invoking the founders to settle a contemporary political argument carries an implicit assumption that modern American government is the fulfillment of their vision, that they would recognize it, approve of it, and feel vindicated by what it became. Modern American government would be almost unrecognizable to the founders as a group, and specific elements of it would horrify different founders for completely opposite reasons. The United States maintains the world's largest defense budget and a permanent professional military establishment, an institution the founders viewed with near universal suspicion as the historical instrument of tyranny. They were not quietly resigned to it. They were explicitly opposed. The direct election of United States senators, now considered a basic democratic norm, was rejected at the founding. Senators were chosen by state legislatures until the 17th Amendment in 1913, more than a century after ratification. Political parties, which the founders condemned with striking unanimity, now control every branch of government so completely that independent political action at the national level is functionally impossible. Jefferson believed the Constitution should be entirely rewritten every 19 years, calculating that as the length of one generation so that no living generation could be permanently bound by the decisions of people already dead. That position would make him a radical in current constitutional discourse. Asking what the founders would think of modern America is like asking the people who designed a farmhouse what they think of the data center someone is running in it. 30. Aaron Burr killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel in 1804, and history has largely agreed that this makes Burr the villain of the founding era, the bad actor in a story with a clear moral. The fuller context makes the moral considerably less clear and the villain designation considerably more constructed. Hamilton had actively sabotaged Burr's political career across multiple crucial moments. He intervened in the 1800 presidential election to support Jefferson over Burr despite their shared party, then campaigned against Burr's New York gubernatorial run in 1804 with what Burr characterized as a years-long pattern of deliberate slander that had materially damaged his reputation and his livelihood. Dueling was a legal, socially accepted practice for settling disputes of honor among men of their class and era. Hamilton had participated in the culture of affairs of honor throughout his career and had coached others through the process. Hamilton fired his pistol during the duel. His shot went wide. Whether he deliberately missed or simply missed is a question historians have debated without resolution, but he was not a passive participant in what followed. Burr was charged with murder in both New York and New Jersey after the duel, but was never brought to trial in either state. He completed his term as Vice President of the United States, presiding over the Senate after killing Hamilton. History needed a villain for this story. Burr got the role, and the complexity got edited out. 31. The myth of the self-made founder is one of the most persistent and appealing in American political culture. Regular men of modest backgrounds who rose through merit, virtue, and sheer intelligence to build something that had never existed before. The overwhelming majority of the men at the Constitutional Convention were wealthy, established, propertied members of the colonial elite. Of the 55 delegates, approximately 34 were lawyers, and 24 were large landowners or planters, with significant overlap between those categories. Washington was one of the wealthiest men in Virginia before the Revolution began. Jefferson inherited substantial land and enslaved people. Madison came from a major Virginia planting family with deep roots in the colonial establishment. Property requirements for voting in the founding era meant that the democracy the founders built was created by and explicitly for men who owned significant assets, a group estimated at somewhere between 6 and 20% of the total adult population depending on the state and the year. Hamilton is the genuine exception to this pattern, born out of wedlock in the Caribbean to a mother of limited means, which is partly why his story carries such emotional weight. Genuine self-made origin stories among the major founders are rare enough to stand out precisely because the rule was comfortable inheritance. The revolution was led largely by the richest men in the colonies arguing with great eloquence about freedom. 32. The term Founding Fathers is used constantly in American political discourse as though it were a neutral, ancient, and obvious description of the men who built the Republic, a fixed historical category with clear and stable membership. The phrase was coined by Warren G. Harding in a 1916 speech and popularized through his subsequent use of it, meaning it was invented by a president most Americans struggle to name, less than a century before the present day. Before Harding's usage took hold, the men of the Revolutionary era were referred to variously as patriots, framers, revolutionaries, or simply by individual name. The specific choice of the word fathers carries significant ideological weight that is rarely examined. It frames subsequent generations as children, implies a relationship of obligation and inheritance, and positions the founders' decisions as parental guidance rather than historical choices made by fallible people under specific pressures. The canonical membership of who counts as a founding father has shifted considerably over time based on political context and cultural need. Hamilton was effectively erased from popular consciousness for most of the 20th century before his rehabilitation. Women, free black citizens, and indigenous people who played material roles in the founding period are structurally excluded from the category by its gendered and racialized framing. The authority that phrase carries in American arguments is doing an enormous amount of work for a term invented in the 19-teens. 33. The Constitution is often invoked as a document the founders wrote for the ages, a perfect and permanent framework they intended to endure unchanged, its meaning fixed at the moment of ratification. Several of the most important founders expected frequent revision, actively wanted it, and built the amendment process on the explicit assumption that the document would need to change as circumstances changed. Jefferson's position, expressed across multiple letters to multiple correspondents, was that constitutions should expire automatically every 19 years, which he calculated as the functional length of one human generation, on the principle that no living generation should be permanently bound by the decisions of people who were already dead when they were born. Madison, the primary architect of the document, wrote numerous letters expressing genuine concern about its adequacy for circumstances he could not predict and emphasizing the importance of interpretive flexibility. The Bill of Rights itself is a fundamental revision of the original document made within 3 years of ratification, meaning the perfect original had significant enough omissions to require immediate correction before the new government had found its footing. The amendment process was deliberately made difficult, but explicitly not impossible. The founders were unambiguous that the document needed to remain changeable. Using the phrase "the founders intended to argue against constitutional change" is arguing against something the founders explicitly expected, actively designed for, and in several cases enthusiastically wanted. 34. The Benjamin Franklin most people carry around in their heads is the jolly avuncular inventor, the kite-flying grandfather of the Revolution, charming the French with his wit and his fur cap and his general air of benevolent wisdom. Franklin was a brilliantly ruthless intelligence operative and one of the most effective political manipulators of the 18th century, whose entire public persona was itself a calculated instrument of statecraft. While serving as America's representative in France during the Revolution, Franklin ran one of the most sophisticated influence operations of the era, feeding deliberate disinformation to British intelligence agents, recruiting French political allies through carefully managed social access, and coordinating a network of couriers carrying sensitive correspondence across multiple countries simultaneously. He operated a printing press in France that produced fabricated British documents, including a counterfeit account of British officers paying for American scalps, designed specifically to shift European public opinion against Britain at a moment when French support for the American cause was not yet guaranteed. His celebrated personal image as the natural philosopher from the American wilderness was itself a consciously crafted performance. Franklin understood that French intellectuals were fascinated by the romantic idea of American innocence and simplicity, and he played to that fascination with the precision of someone who understood exactly what he was doing and why. He cultivated the image of the humble inventor. The humble inventor was building an intelligence network. Those two things were not in conflict. 35. The First Amendment was ratified in 1791, and Americans are taught that it immediately established strong, reliable protection for speech and press against government interference, a foundational freedom in force from the beginning. 7 years after ratification, the federal government passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which made it a federal crime to publish criticism of the president or Congress, and the founders who passed it considered it entirely constitutional. The Sedition Act of 1798 criminalized false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government, with penalties including fines and imprisonment. At least 25 people were arrested under it, and 10 were convicted. The law was written and passed by Federalists and signed by John Adams with the explicit purpose of suppressing criticism from the Democratic-Republican opposition press during a period of political tension with France, making it nakedly partisan in its application from the first day of enforcement. Several newspaper editors went to prison for publishing criticism of Adams' administration. Matthew Lyon, a sitting congressman from Vermont, was convicted under the act, sentenced to 4 months in prison, and was subsequently re-elected by his constituents from his jail cell. Jefferson and Madison's response to the acts, arguing that states could nullify federal laws they found unconstitutional, created a legal doctrine that would later be deployed extensively in defense of slavery. Free speech in America has always required active defense. The founding generation understood this. They also kept testing it from the inside. 36. The common framing is that while the founders were imperfect products of their era, they broadly understood slavery as a moral wrong and expected it to fade naturally as the country matured and its founding ideals took hold. Many were deeply, actively, specifically committed to preserving slavery indefinitely, and the constitutional compromises on slavery were not reluctant concessions extracted by bad actors from reluctant idealists. They were aggressive victories won by the slaveholding interest over people who objected but ultimately capitulated. The founders from South Carolina and Georgia arrived at the Constitutional Convention with explicit, non-negotiable demands for slavery's protection and won most of them. Charles Cotesworth Pinckney returned home and told his state legislature that the Constitution provided more security for slavery than they had reasonably hoped to achieve going into the negotiations. The slave trade received a specific 20-year constitutional guarantee against federal interference, a protection written into the document at the demand of the Deep South delegations. Madison, who privately described slavery as a moral and political evil, argued against including anti-slavery language in the Constitution because Southern states would simply refuse to ratify any document that contained it, and he was right about the political math. Jefferson's private correspondence shows a man who understood the contradiction between his stated principles and his practice with considerable clarity, and chose, repeatedly, to resolve it in favor of his comfort. The gradual elimination story was always more comfortable than the document support. 37. Washington is the indispensable genius, the irreplaceable strategic mind, without whom the revolution fails, a man whose battlefield brilliance matched his moral stature. He lost more engagements than he won. He was consistently outmaneuvered by British commanders during the war's early and most critical phase. And Yorktown, the victory that is his defining military legacy, required a French naval fleet to make it possible. The loss of New York in 1776 was a genuine operational disaster. The campaign included the fall of Fort Washington, where approximately 5,000 American soldiers were captured in a single engagement, a catastrophic outcome that historians connect substantially to Washington's command decisions in the weeks leading up to it. The Yorktown campaign in 1781, the siege that effectively ended the war, succeeded because Admiral de Grasse's French fleet blocked British naval access to the Chesapeake, preventing Cornwallis from being reinforced or evacuated. Without that fleet, the strategic situation at Yorktown is entirely different. French military forces, French financial support, and French naval power were as consequential to the outcome of the revolution as the Continental Army across the final years of the conflict. Washington's actual strategic genius, and it was real, lay in understanding when not to fight, keeping an army operational through repeated retreat, and maintaining enough institutional coherence to survive until circumstances improved. That is a legitimate and demanding form of military skill. It is also not what the mythology describes. 38. Crispus Attucks died in the Boston Massacre in 1770 and is taught as the first martyr of the American Revolution, a tragic figure caught in the wrong place at the wrong moment, his death transformed into a symbol by the Patriot movement. Attucks was not a passive bystander. He was a prominent figure in the Boston working-class resistance, a mixed-race man of Wampanoag and African descent who had escaped from slavery and spent years working as a sailor before settling into the active political life of pre-revolutionary Boston. Contemporary accounts from the night of the massacre, including trial testimony, describe Attucks as one of the most aggressive members of the crowd, confronting the British soldiers, carrying a cordwood stick, and reportedly striking at the soldiers before the shooting began. John Adams, defending the soldiers at trial, described Attucks specifically as a dangerous mob leader whose actions contributed to the violence. The Patriot movement did something revealing in the aftermath. They celebrated Attucks as a martyr and used his death to inflame public opinion against British occupation while simultaneously minimizing his agency, his mixed-race identity, and the fact that he had been enslaved. He became useful as a symbol in a way that required keeping his actual biography vague. The first person to die for American independence was a formerly enslaved mixed-race man who was also described as a rioter by the lawyer who would later become its second president. 39. The system of checks and balances established by the American Constitution is presented as a uniquely American political invention, the product of founder genius applied to the specific problems of a new nation building self-governance from scratch. The concept was drawn almost directly from a French political philosopher named Montesquieu, who had developed the separation of powers framework by analyzing the British constitutional system, and the founders were open about this intellectual debt in their own writing. Montesquieu's The Spirit of the Laws, published in 1748, is the primary intellectual source for the separation of executive, legislative, and judicial power as a governing principle. Madison and Hamilton cited it repeatedly and explicitly in the Federalist Papers, rather than obscuring the source. The British constitutional system already featured a functional separation between the Crown, Parliament, and an independent judiciary that the founders studied in considerable detail and consciously adapted. The specific American innovation that was genuinely new was the written, codified Constitution as the supreme law of the land. The idea that a document itself could hold legal authority above any individual branch, officer, or institution. That was more structurally original than the separation of powers framework, which had been theorized and partially implemented elsewhere for generations. America built an exceptional vehicle from parts that had existed for a long time and then developed a habit of describing the vehicle as a completely original invention, which requires some consistent maintenance to sustain. 40. America's self-image as the world's democracy spreader, the nation destined by its founding to carry freedom to oppress peoples everywhere, is presented as an expression of original founding vision. The dominant foreign policy thinking of the founding era was almost precisely the opposite, a deep and principled commitment to non-entanglement in other nations' affairs, and a specific fear that democratic politics would drag the country into unnecessary foreign conflicts. Washington's farewell address, the document most frequently cited as the distillation of founding wisdom, devotes more sustained attention to warning against foreign alliances and entanglements than to virtually any other subject. His concern was not modest. He believed that democratic factional politics would inevitably produce pressure to take sides in foreign conflicts for ideological reasons, and that this would be destructive to the republic. Jefferson's phrase Empire of Liberty referred to geographic expansion across the North American continent, not a global mission to install democratic governments in other countries. John Quincy Adams delivered a speech in 1821, drawing on founding-era thinking that explicitly stated, "America goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy," a direct rejection of the idea that American power should be used to promote or install democracy elsewhere. The Monroe Doctrine, built on the same intellectual foundation, was a defensive warning to European powers to stay out of the Western Hemisphere, not an expansionist promise to spread freedom outward. America, the global democracy promoter, was a 20th century foreign policy choice that reached backward for founding authority it was never actually given. 41. America's revolution is presented as a clean cultural break, the birth of an entirely new civilization with new ideas, new institutions, and a new relationship to governance that owed nothing essential to the British system it rejected. American legal, political, and cultural institutions are almost entirely derived from British models. The Revolution changed who held power. It did not change the fundamental architecture of how power was organized and exercised. American common law descends directly from English common law. The legal principles of habeas corpus, trial by jury, the presumption of innocence, the adversarial legal process, the role of precedent, all of these came from Britain and were explicitly continued rather than replaced. The structure of Congress mirrors Parliament with intention, a bicameral legislature with a lower house based on proportional representation and an upper house designed as a brake on popular impulse. The tradition of local governance that Americans associate with self-determination, town meetings, county courts, local sheriffs, was carried directly from British colonial administrative structures with minimal modification. The political language the founders used to justify the revolution, natural rights, social contract, limited government, popular sovereignty, came primarily from British philosophers including John Locke, who had developed it during Britain's own glorious revolution of 1688, almost a century earlier. America broke free from Britain the way a franchise separates from its parent company. New ownership, new branding, same operating manual, with some chapters revised. 42. The founding era is treated in American popular culture as settled, well understood, definitively known-ese territory. The bedrock facts of national origin that education established and time confirmed. Founding era history is one of the most actively contested, continuously revised fields in all of historical scholarship, and a substantial portion of what the general public carries as settled fact was written more than a century after the events by people with identifiable ideological purposes. The canonization of great men founding history occurred largely in the 19th century. Mason Weems, a bookseller and writer, invented the cherry tree story about Washington in a biography published in 1800, 4 years after Washington's death, and it's circulated as fact for generations. The founding era looks dramatically different depending on whether your primary sources are the correspondence of Virginia planters, the legal petitions of free black citizens in northern cities, the diplomatic records of indigenous nations negotiating with competing imperial powers, or the journals of ordinary Continental Army soldiers. For most of American history, only one of those source types was considered serious historical evidence. Major reinterpretations of the founding, including the centrality of slavery to the economic and political structure, the active roles of women, the contributions of non-elite and non-white Americans, have substantially changed professional historical understanding within the past 40 years. The founders understood they were constructing a historical narrative. Franklin, Hamilton, and Jefferson all managed their own legacies actively, editing correspondence and shaping memoirs with considerable care. The founding isn't settled history, it's a live argument wearing a powdered wig. Which of these 42 did you believe most completely before today? Drop it in the comments, because that's where the real argument starts. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.